So when I decided to write this book, I initially was just going to write a straight narrative history of the reemergence of great replacement theory over the last 20 years, likely moving back in time at periods in the book, even before that. But I thought it was important to not only chronicle this theory in its totality, but also chronicle and really explore the ingredients that make up the theory.
Good evening, everyone. How are you? Okay. Welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Kate Schatz. I'm an author and an educator, and I'm assuming, like many of you, I am someone who's been deeply impacted by the work of this evening's guest. So it is such an honor to be here to moderate this conversation with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Yes. I'm going to make you really cheer loud in a second. But Dr. Kendi is a professor of history and the founding director of the Howard University Institute for Advanced Study, which is an interdisciplinary research enterprise examining global racism. He is the author of the National Book Award-winning Stamped from the Beginning and the international bestseller How to Be an Anti-Racist, and many, many other books that are not in this bio, but there are many more. And he has been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, which is known as the Genius Grant. His latest book is Chain of Ideas: The Origins of Our Authoritarian Age. It explains how great replacement theory has become a dominant political idea of our time and what we need to do to free ourselves from it. Dr. Kendi is on an incredible book tour. He has been in so many cities, so let's give him like an extra Bay Area welcome. Dr. Kendi, welcome to the Commonwealth Club. That's good. All right. There we go. There we go. Bay Area represent. Good job, everyone. Hello, Dr. Kendi.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And like I said, you are on an extensive book tour. It's a lot. I wanted to just start by asking how you're feeling doing this many events, being in front of this many people, sharing this book.
Well, first, Kate, I want to thank you for your willingness to facilitate this conversation. Good evening, everyone. I'm really excited and happy to be here in community with each of you. And Kate mentioned I have a pretty extensive tour around this country and even going into Canada. And part of the reason why we decided to do such an extended tour is maybe something we're going to actually talk about tonight, which is how much the mainstream media has been captured by authoritarians. And so as a result, when you come out with books that are deeply critical of authoritarians, it's harder to go on the media and you have to actually go directly to the people. And so to me, it's actually been a good thing because I've actually, instead of talking through TVs, I'm actually able to touch and feel and then really be able to look people in their eyes as we talk about this book.
Yeah, great. I wanted to ask two questions I think all of us are wondering, which is, what is happening and will we be okay? I'm mostly kidding with that one, but because you actually do kind of talk about, you basically explain what is happening with this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me say, when I set out to write this book, and frankly, when I set out for the research for this book, I actually did not know that I was going to be writing a book on great replacement theory, let alone that I was going to be taking the reader throughout history and even around the world. I actually set out with similar research questions, which is, what is happening, why is it happening, and frankly, how are we going to be okay? And I'm the most hopeless when I don't understand what's happening.
Yeah.
If I don't know anybody who's like me, and so the more I gained a sense of clarity in terms of what's happening in the world, what's happening to my country, what's happening in our politics, the more clarity I gain, the more hope that I gain, because then we can start formulating how to challenge this thing.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us your definition of the Great Replacement Theory, which is what this book is about? What is the Great Replacement Theory?
Well, let me first say, this is a definition based on me able to chronicle the full and entire history of Great Replacement Theory and all of its mutations. And I just think that it is important to just state that, because I think too often when it comes to the defining terms like Great Replacement Theory or even racism, people are defining it from the standpoint of their own time period, or even more viciously, they're defining it in a way that excludes their own ideas or their own practices, or even their own country. So all that to say, I define Great Replacement Theory as a political theory that suggests these powerful, shadowy, globalist elites are enabling peoples of color to displace the lives and even livelihoods and even electoral power of white people who apparently need authoritarian protection. And so when we hear terms or things like immigrants are invading the nation, we're hearing Great Replacement Theory. When we hear ideas like the enemy is inside the gates, the construct of the internal enemy is central to Great Replacement Theory. When we hear ideas like those immigrants from Asia and Africa are poisoning the blood of the nation, we're hearing Great Replacement Theory. Even when we hear things like diversity programs are discriminatory and leading to jobs being taken. Instead of the immigrant taking the job, now it's the diversity programs apparently taking the job.
Right. So you said, again, that you didn't set out to write this book and that you were researching these ideas kind of individually, and then you realized that they were connected. How and when did you realize that? Like, did you have an aha moment when you realized all of these things were connected?
So most of the links in the chain of ideas, I had researched or studied, or even to a certain extent written about them in previous books. And to sort of level set, the book Chain of Ideas is organized into 10 sections, which in the book I call them links. And each of these links are ideas. And each of these ideas collectively form the chain of ideas or Great Replacement Theory. And so when I decided to write this book, I initially was just going to write a straight narrative history of the reemergence of Great Replacement Theory over the last 20 years, likely moving back in time at periods in the book, even before that. But I thought it was important to not only chronicle this theory in its totality, but also chronicle and really explore the ingredients that make up the theory. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to do both simultaneously because I think it's important for people to understand both the theory in its totality as well as the ideas that comprise them. And it also allowed me to show that the ideas that make up Great Replacement Theory, or the chain of ideas, each of these 10 links, have varied histories. And so some of them may go back to the thoughts of enslavers. Others of them may go back to the thoughts of colonial officials. Others may go back to the thoughts of eugenicists, right? Others of them may go back to the thoughts of somebody like a Christopher Columbus. You name it. They have a varied history.
Yeah, and so that our audience knows, and I realize I also want to say, this book is so brilliant, and thank you for it. I mean, I told you a little backstage, I read it, I just felt like every page I turned, I was just like mind blown. I almost wanted, you make so many connections. I was imagining, you know, like in a movie when someone's trying to solve the crime and they've got the giant board with all the pictures and the strings and everything. There's so many connections, but I think one thing the audience should know is that this book is also absolutely global. Right? And so for folks that are familiar with your work around anti-racism and your work where you're looking so closely at the history of the United States, you've really zoomed out with this book. I mean, you're tracing these ideas. We've got Bolsonaro in Brazil, we've got Modi in India, we've got Le Pen in France, we're in Israel, we're in the Netherlands, and of course we're in the United States. I wanted to just ask, why did you feel that it was important in this particular moment to do a book that is so global? And then what's the common playbook?
Well, first, I think it's important for us as writers and historians to develop a book based on the topic as opposed to us deciding what we want to write. In other words, Great Replacement Theory has always been a transnational, global, it's had multiple manifestations in different countries. And so for me to write, let's say, a history of the reemergence of Great Replacement Theory solely in the United States, you know, that's literally like, you know, me writing a history of the Golden State Warriors and only talking about Draymond Green, right? I mean, it's like, I'm not going to talk about Clay. I'm not going to talk about Steph. Like you know, you can't really understand these championships.
Yeah. But we got to do the history. We got to talk about Chris Mullin. Like, yes. We got to go back. Yes. We got to talk about Tim.
And so, is it possible to do it? Yes, but it would be incomplete, right? So that was the first reason. And indeed, the term "the Great Replacement" was coined by a French novelist named Renaud Camus in a speech he gave in 2010, which became a book in 2011. And this is an idea, though, Great Replacement Theory, that had been around for quite some time, but Camus named it. And just to give some context, ideas are not like people. People are typically named around the time they're born. Ideas can live for centuries, you know, before they're actually named. And one other quick point, after deciding to write more of a global history and deciding that I was going to have 10 sections and each of those 10 sections were going to be set in a different country and none of those countries was going to be the United States. Mm-hmm. But the US story is woven throughout the text. It also, I think it's going to allow American readers to see just how much the playbook you had asked about that this regime is using, particularly in the last year, had been written and refined and utilized in other countries. And then I also think now when I go, let's say, to Europe or even to Canada, as I'm going in a few weeks to talk about racism, it's going to be harder for them to say racism is only a US problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What you just said about ideas persisting for a long time before they're named, I think you heard the audience, it's such an interesting and fascinating point, but it's also something that you really explore in the book, which is also how ideas get renamed and rehashed, and the way that you do that with Nazi ideology and propaganda and language, and really show how it keeps showing up and getting named and renamed is, I think, incredibly eye-opening in this book. And also the distinction that you make between the idea of Nazism and neo-Nazism. Can you talk a little bit about that distinction?
Sure. So, not to give it away, but I ultimately...
Spoiler alert.
I ultimately position Great Replacement theory as a neo-Nazi theory. And one of the reasons why, part of the reason why I make that case is because, first and foremost, I think that we have commonly understood neo-Nazism in a way that I don't think is applicable. In other words, most people, when they think of neo-Nazism, they think of people after 1945, let's say denying the Holocaust, or hailing Hitler, or calling for the return of the Third Reich, or supporting or calling for genocidal anti-Semitism. And from my standpoint, that's just a Nazi. There's nothing neo about any of that. There's nothing new about any of that. But to me, let's say if Nazis in 1940 or even 2026 talked about that there's this construct of international Jewry that is dominating and controlling the world and facilitating aliens to, quote unquote, come to nations and take them over, as Nazis made the case about, framing aliens as Jews and other undesirables. There's actually a renovation to that idea. So instead of the idea of international Jewry, now they call them globalists. Or if the Jew is the fundamental internal enemy in Europe in 1940, then now they're considering the fundamental internal enemy to be Muslim. Right? And if in 1940 they classified anti-Nazis intellectuals as cultural Bolsheviks, now they call them cultural Marxists. Right? And so you see all these renovations, as I literally talk about that what these Great Replacement theorists have done is they have taken the house of Hitler, stripped it to its bones, and renovated it. New walls, new drywalls, new fixtures, new furniture. So then you walk into this home and you can't even tell that the bones are Nazism because the terminology has changed. What you see has changed. And that is Great Replacement theory.
Yes. So back to the structure of the book, you have these 10 links, these 10 ideas that, again, take us to 10 different countries. I'm wondering if there was a particular link in the chain, a particular idea that was especially challenging for you, both to research and to write about.
So can I give two?
You can guess. Okay, fine, yes.
So one was more challenging for me, just what I try to do when I write about racist ideas is I just try to tell the story. But some of them are just so ridiculous that it's hard not to just, and so the sixth link in the chain of ideas is that white Christians are indigenous to the nation. And that is an idea that is not only put forth by these politicians and theorists in the United States, but also in countries like South Africa, countries like Chile, countries like New Zealand and Australia, and then even Europe. Great replacement theorists there position European civilization as rooted in Christianity. Now, to give some context, Christianity did not take hold in Europe until about the 4th century AD. Europeans were formulating civilization for 44,000 years before that. So that's what's striking. Even in the case of Europe, it makes no historical sense. So that was challenging, right? But the one that was the most conceptually challenging to explain, and it took me a while to really get the language to explain it, was the final link in the chain of ideas. And that final link is to fight for privileges provided by dictators instead of power provided by democracy.
Will you say that one more time?
Fight for privileges provided by dictators instead of power provided by democracy. Yeah. And this is the final link in the chain of ideas, because once these theorists can get people to do this, they have them. Yeah. They have them chained. And ultimately, the goal, right, is to get people to believe that that dictator is using their awesome power to protect their privileges. So all I want is my privilege. I just want to have a little bit more than those other folks. Even if I have no power, even if I have no rights, even if I have no freedoms, all I want is my privilege. Yeah. And so once you can get people to covet and desire their privilege more than their power, and you can make them believe that because they have privilege, they have power, you can get them to consent to their own domination.
Just want to get through those TSA lines as fast as we can. They're really just bringing in those guys to help us with that one. So I mentioned how in reading this book, as I just encountered connection after connection that you're drawing, I kind of wanted a visual map. I really did want to ask you how you organized the ideas of this book. And I'm asking as a writer, just like intellectually and practically, how did you organize? Did you use a lot of note cards? Is it a Google Doc? Are there lists? I know you have incredible research assistants as well, but there's so many names and dates and really deep connections that you're drawing. What does the map look like?
So generally speaking, I think once I set out to write a book, or once I set out to write Chain of Ideas, I had a set of, I had a somewhat general structure that I was envisioning that the book would be. And that structure then gave me the ability to collect a bunch of research materials, primary and secondary, based on what I envisioned would be needed for this book. And so once that collection was finished, then I ultimately went through all of those research materials and created a pretty significant research outline. And what the research outline does for me is it allows me to actually map the totality of all of the research that I've collected. Which then gives me the ability to see what I likely need more research for. And so then once I go back and finish that additional research, I take that research outline and I take the research materials and create a massive writing outline. And so that's when I start to organize where different concepts in the book is going to be. That's when I can take the research and start making all these connections that I ultimately write out in the book. And to me, that's the most important part of the process of producing a book, because and it probably takes me as much time as actually doing the research itself. Because once I get to the point of writing, I just want to focus on the actual craft of writing. So I want to have made all those connections and transitions. I wanted to do the conceptual work, before I get to actually writing.
Sorry for that nerdy process question, but that makes so much sense the way that you say it. And I think your craft is so beautiful and clear, and that makes so much sense that you have all that research and structure kind of there, and then you can focus on that craft. One thing I wanted on that note. We are obviously living in a time of a lot of breaking news, and I'm so curious to know how you stay focused on writing a book that speaks to this present moment, but how do you not get derailed by information chaos as you're trying to write a book that is going to feel relevant, but also you have to have some parameters and stop writing at some point?
Well, this was hard. So I think that this was probably one of the more challenging aspects of writing the book. To give an example, the third section is set in Chile, and the major politician that I follow in Chile is Jose Antonio Cast. And each of the sections revolve around a particular scene. And so in the case of the third section, it is Jose Antonio Cast engaging in a political debate back in, I believe it would have been 2021. And so it's a political debate right before the first round of the presidential election. He ultimately loses that presidential election. And by 2024, when I'm writing the book, he's running again for president, but he's not necessarily leading in the polls. He's second in the polls. So I mention this because when the book was initially finished, the first draft, I described that, particularly in the epilogue, that, he was running again and, he was second in the polls. Then he ultimately wins the election. And he actually took office a few days ago. So what I actually had to do, like literally at the last minute, we had to create two different potential lines in the epilogue about what happens to Jose Antonio Cast. Looking at all the data, I actually predicted he was likely going to win, so I wrote that in, and ultimately he did. But yeah, I think only because he was such a major character in the text, I thought it was important to put that in there. But yeah, that came down to the wire.
Yeah, I imagine. I often tell the story of when Kamau Bell and I were writing Do the Work, our anti-racist activity book. We had a deadline for a major draft on January 6th.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We did not make that deadline. And I'll never forget emailing our editor that morning, being like, I think we need to maybe add this in. So I really wondered that. And it seems like at some point you just have to decide the book is done. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about a bit backstage, you've said that you wish this book weren't so relevant. Yeah. Okay. So this question, I don't totally want to talk about this, but it's really important that we do. Because in this book, you're talking about ideas, but you're connecting these ideas and great replacement theory not just to rhetoric, but also to state violence and to mass violence. And can you talk about how these ideas actually move into and show up in action?
Sure. So not only have these ideas great replacement theory, been used to justify authoritarian sort of swipes in authoritarian states, but these ideas have also routinely incited mass shootings, genocide, and even war. I think that it's important to know that the most extreme form of racist great replacement theory is this idea that white people, let's say in the United States or even in other countries, are suffering a genocide at the hands of quote unquote black criminals, Muslim terrorists, and immigrants of color. And so if you, let's say, believe that, right? Let's say you are a young person and you've come across a website that has this massive list of quote unquote black on white crimes, and you're just day after day going through this website. At the same time, you have great replacement theorists over here saying that this white genocide is happening, and you don't have the context that white people are far and away more likely to be harmed by other white people, whether in the United States or other countries, you may end up getting a gun, driving a few hours from your home, walking into a Bible study with about 10 black people engaged in Bible study, and ultimately opening fire in Charleston, South Carolina. Or if you believe that if you've been misled by great replacement theory into believing that Jews are facilitating immigrants of color who are coming into the country and they're slaughtering your people, you're going to get your gun and shoot up the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Or if you believe that the most visible group of replacers in the United States today are African Americans, you're going to get a gun and shoot at black people in a supermarket in Buffalo. Or if you believe that the Democratic Party is importing voters, particularly from Latin America, and as a result of this Democratic Party importing voters for Latin America, the Democratic Party is going to be able to take over Texas. And once they take over Texas, they're going to take your jobs and your privileges and lead and continuously harm people like you. Then you're going to get your gun and go to a Walmart in El Paso and engage in one of the largest mass shootings of Latino Americans in history. And similarly, if you believe that Muslims are ravaging your country, that they're fundamentally terrorists, then you're going to get your gun, put on a live stream, and open fire at Muslims in 2 different mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. And you're going to write before that a manifesto called The Great Replacement.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of those examples that you just gave, as you show in the book, as you draw the connections, a lot of those perpetrators were accessing those ideas on the internet. Mm-hmm. You do argue in the book that one of the, we need to expel conspiracy theories, disinformation, and hate speech from social media platforms. That's one of the kind of your calls to action toward the end of the book. I just want to name that we're sitting in a building down the street from the Meta headquarters. We're blocks from where old Twitter used to be. I don't know. Are they still there? Did they? I don't know. But we're in it right here. You know, this is the Bay Area. We're progressive and we're cool and we're a bubble, but we're also where this started, where the internet and where social media has been built. When the owners of these social media platforms are either great replacement theorists themselves or incredibly cozy with the billionaires who are, how do we expel those ideas from social media? And I know that there's not actually a great answer here, but I would love to hear your take.
Well, I think that this is where if these companies are not going to ensure the moderation or moderating of their own platforms, this is where government has to come in and require them to. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have years and decades worth of evidence that demonstrates that ideas can turn deadly. Mm-hmm. What's striking about these social media platforms is even when they were moderating speech, Facebook as an example, they created a carve-out for what they called political speech. And that carve-out was initially created in the aftermath of this current president, when he was running for president the first time, calling for a ban on Muslims, and obviously demonizing them to justify that ban. And so Facebook, as I write about in Chain of Ideas, decides that it's going to create a carve-out of political speech so that, we're not going to moderate political speech. And what's striking about that is the most dangerous form of speech is political speech. So that's like, okay. And so, I tried to show in the text just how critical these social media platforms have actually been to the spread of great replacement theory. Even there is the section that I speak about this or write about this is set in El Salvador. And it's set in El Salvador because the president of El Salvador, who is in his 30s, has built one of the largest and most sophisticated troll farms of any politician in the world, and has captured a large share of the social media airways within El Salvador based on not only his accounts and his government accounts, but the accounts of his bots and trolls and social media influencers. And so he is able, through social media, to capture and frankly chain the minds of many people within his country. Even he's able to write on his Twitter that he's the coolest dictator in the world and not necessarily face much of a pushback.
Oh, sorry to laugh. Sometimes we have to. You write a lot in the book about zero-sum thinking. That's a really critical idea throughout the book. And can you define, kind of explain how zero-sum thinking functions with these ideas, and then how it leads to this idea of divisiveness?
Sure. So zero-sum thinking, let's say from a racialized standpoint, is when you have, let's say if a white American believes that they're seeing Black people progress, so that progress must be coming at the expense of white people.
Yeah.
That's a zero-sum idea. And the inverse could be thought of. You know what? We need to suppress the progress of Black people in order to improve our capability to progress. But this isn't certainly just an idea that operates as it relates to race. It also operates as it relates to gender, when you can have, let's say, men believing that as they see women gaining more and more opportunities and stature, that somehow men are losing out, right? Or even as it relates to religion or ethnicity and on the line. The reason why this is critical to great replacement theory is because great replacement theorists want people to believe that their status is being lost, that their lives, that their jobs are being lost. And one of the ways that they attempt to make that case when the data doesn't actually support it is they give examples, particularly examples of prominent or powerful, let's say, Black people in positions of power. You see that one person was elected president of the United States, so it means that Black people are all powerful. They've taken over the whole world. Or that one Black person was hired, now there's 2 Black people, and suddenly, like, there's no opportunities for white people at a company where it's 75% white. And so it allows for, but I think what's the most devastating about zero-sum thinking is that I don't think when people believe that idea, particularly low and middle income white people, they're going to then be likely to oppose anti-racist and equitable policies that are actually, let's say, helping Black people to progress because they're less likely to be systematically excluded via racist policies. And so they're going to oppose that type of policy shift, even as they're more likely to benefit from that policy shift if they're low and middle income. And so when you even look at white America, there was less inequality within white America between the 1930s and the 1960s, 1970s. Why? What was it about American policy during that time period, particularly in the 60s and 70s? Well, that was one of the high points of equitable policies. That was the beginning of civil rights activism, I should say policy. And so what happens is people started opposing the very policies, the very equity that was helping them on the pretext that if it's helping those people, it must be harming me. And so now you literally have white people who are like, I am against universal health care for all because that means Black people are going to get it, so it must not be good for me. I mean, that's the delusion.
So the last time that I saw you speak was in 2022. You were in conversation with W. Kamau Bell, our local and national treasure. So shout out Kamau. You were at a church in Berkeley. It was June 25th, 2022. And if we remember that June 24th, 2022 was the Dobbs decision, Supreme Court decision. We asked, you were asked some questions about reproductive justice at that event. And I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit to bring it to gender and to reproductive justice. How does the control of women's bodies, how does it intersect with great replacement theory?
Sure. So, remember when I spoke about white genocide? I mentioned that these great replacement theorists position those who are bringing about white genocide as Muslim terrorists, Black criminals, immigrants of color. Well, there's actually a fourth group that these great replacement theorists have positioned as bringing on the genocide of white people. And that is white women who are refusing to have many children. So if you're a, quote, childless cat lady, to use the vice president's term, they're arguing that you're bringing on the genocide of white people. If you are deciding to have 1 child or 2 children, you're bringing on the genocide of white people. And why do they say that? Because they point to low or declining white birth rates And who do they blame for the lower declining white birth rates? White women who are not having the so-called replacement rate of children. And one of the things you're going to read in Chain of Ideas is how they describe these women. And just to give you some context, over here they're talking about, we're going to protect you. But then over here, they say that you're bringing on the genocide, which then, of course, justifies all sorts of violence against women, right? So I think that to me, like the other forms of political violence, is certainly an insidious form. But the other group of people who they argue is bringing on a genocide is anyone who is opposed to abortion. I should say anyone who is supporting abortion. And why? Because if they claim that all these babies who are being quote unquote killed, as they call them, are not being born. So again, that's another reason for the genocide of white people. They also claim that queer white people are bringing on the genocide of white people because they're not having babies, right? And these aren't fringe thinkers. I talked about J.D. Vance. There's also a proto-natalist movement that's encouraging white people to have more children that has been supported by somebody by the name of Elon Musk, who has, 14 children that we know of? But if you listen to why he has so many children, he's going to express that he is seeking to save the white race. I don't think the white race wants him to have children, but, and so there is that gendered component to it, right? The other component specifically that relates to gender is that just as these great replacement theorists claim that there is this war against white people, they also claim there's a war against men. Yeah. And they specifically say there's a war against white men. And they have attempted to say to white men, the reason why you may not have the job that you want, or you may not be getting that house that you want, or that status is being lost, is not because billionaires or the super wealthy are hoarding wealth, or because they're supporting policies that are actually making it hard for you to get the things that you want. No, they're seeking to distract. Mostly, these white men are seeking to distract other white men into blaming women and people of color and immigrants.
So I'm going to get to a few questions about hope, and then to some of our audience questions. But before we get to hope and maybe a little bit of joy, so maybe we could stay in the rage for a second. You mentioned J.D. Vance and you mentioned Elon Musk. A question that I wanted to ask you to bring in another figure that is in your book. What would you say right now if we were suddenly joined by Stephen Miller? Because I believe that he is actually one of the most insidious architects of this. And cameras rolling, mics on. If he were to appear, what would you ask him? Like, what are the questions that you would want to ask Stephen Miller?
I probably wouldn't ask him questions.
Okay. Fair.
I probably would make a few statements.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And the one that comes to mind is probably one I shouldn't say.
Okay. Yep.
But I'll say it anyway.
Okay.
Is you should probably, since you probably admire Joseph Goebbels,
Yeah.
you should study what happened to him in the end.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So at the end of the book, you do write this sentence, and I quote, there is reason for hope. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, there's quite a bit of, there are many reasons for hope. Not to give all the reasons away that I shared, but the book ultimately makes the case that great replacement theory has become the most dominant political theory of our time. And it makes that case based on the amount of political violence it's inciting, based on polling data that I cite in the book, and even based on the fact that the prime ministers or presidents or leaders of political parties that are the most popular, or even the major opposition figures of nearly every country in Europe, in almost every country in Latin America, most countries in Asia, and certainly this country, in Canada, have been espousing great replacement theory. Different derivations of great replacement theory based on their specific demographic context. But that doesn't mean every single country has been captured, or that every single president or prime minister or ruling party of every country is being ruled right now by a great replacement politician. And so you have the case of France, where recently in the French parliamentary elections, pretty much all the other major political parties allied together, center-right, center-left, and the quote-unquote leftist party allied together to keep the National Rally, led by Marine Le Pen, out of power. The same thing happened recently in the German parliamentary elections, where the center-right and the center-left party allied together to keep the AfD out of power. You have countries with sizable immigrant populations like Ireland. I think about 20% of the people in Ireland are foreign-born, but great replacement parties have not gained much of any power in Ireland, because I think the people there understand that immigrants actually help the nation as opposed to harm them. You have other countries with very powerful great replacement parties outside of the country that are relatively weak inside the country. And one that I'm thinking about is a political party named Vox, which is in Spain. And this political party has organized the Madrid Forum every other year, in which they brought together Trump, Orban, Cast, as I mentioned, Meloni, many of these politicians that I write about in this book have spoken together on the same stages, because they're constantly organizing together. But Vox has very little power in Spain, right? So that certainly gives me hope, right? You have people who are coming together who are not necessarily been political allies, forming coalitions to keep these authoritarian powers out of power. That gives me hope. I think what also gives me hope is the fact that, as I talked about earlier, these political parties, these politicians, these theorists have gone to great lengths to conceal that great replacement theory is animating their politics. Well, they're not going to be able to conceal it anymore.
Yeah.
So I have hope from that standpoint. And then I have hope because there are a number of organizations that are taking action against these parties, against great replacement theory, against authoritarianism in this country and around the world. We listed many of those organizations on the book website, chainofideasbook.com. And so there's already a force of people fighting back, and we can certainly join them.
Absolutely. As I was reading the book, I kept thinking that I felt each chapter could have like a companion chapter about the resistance movements, the people fighting against each of the scenes you described. We know that there's resistance to it. you do such incredible work as an historian, as a scholar, and a writer, and also really as a public figure, right? As public facing as you are and as you've been for the past few years. I think it's so essential, and it's also really heavy, and I'm sure it takes a toll on you. So I just wanted to ask you how you find joy and peace in your day-to-day life.
Well, I can say, I actually do find it's therapeutic to write. And I think partly because, at least when I'm writing or even researching, I'm just razor focused. It's as if the entire world sort of melts away. And so no matter what's happening, I'm able to focus. And I really learned that when I was writing How to Be an Anti-Racist, when I was going through cancer treatment. It actually allowed me to just think about the fact, at least in those moments, that I was not fighting, frankly, for my life. And so just writing actually is quite therapeutic. And that's maybe one of the reasons why I write so much, right? Because of all the stuff we're having to deal with. I also have a 9-year-old and a 2-year-old. So, every day is certainly joy through them. And no matter what has happened in the world or what character assassination I had to face on that day, I'm just daddy, to them. And I also find joy in the littlest of things, right? And, walking outside and seeing a butterfly, right? Or walking down the street and seeing a couple hug and seeing the joy between them. I try to find joy wherever I can find it.
So the good news is that we have an audience full of incredibly smart people. The bad news is they all wrote questions, and they're really, really wonderful. I'm going to do my best to get to as many of them as I can. I'm going to try to kind of condense some, but I am biased toward educators, so teacher questions are rising to the top. So we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to pair these questions together. So we have a question from someone who says, my colleague and I teach your book Stamped to 8th graders. And I also want to say that my kids at various grades have read your books and come home talking about them and learned so much. So thank you for the work that you've done adapting your work to young readers of all ages. I think that not every scholar prioritizes that in their work, and it's so profound. So teaching Stamped to 8th graders. The question is there a story or concept in Chain of Ideas that can help the teachers better link the students' understanding of anti-racist history to Great Replacement theory today?
Story in Chain of Ideas.
And then I'm going to add, while you're thinking of that one, another educator wants to know how to balance empowering young people to explore and investigate the ideas in your books without stoking fear in them that they're inheriting a broken, hateful world that will rip their agency and even their lives. I don't, yeah. I thought I had the hard-hitting questions.
So I'm going to try to be as concise as possible so we can get to as many questions as possible. The first question, I'll actually say the opening story of Chain of Ideas, in which Renaud Camus is in southern France. He imagines that he's coming across this quote-unquote horde of Muslims from North Africa who he imagines are taking over, who've taken over this town and thereby taken over France and then taken over Europe. But then I actually give the data in which they were only about 6% or so of that actual town. So it allows, I think, young people to understand a conspiracy theory that's not based in fact. So I think that's actually a really good story for young people. The second question, similarly, I think it's important to talk to young people about the construct of propaganda. Meaning there are people in this world who recognize that human beings are likely to love and learn from each other. So they actively seek to get human beings to hate and seek to harm one another. Because what that does is that says to the child, which I actually think is true, that the world is actually a loving place. Mm-hmm. But there are certain individuals who can't get into power in communities that are loving. So they're trying to make people hate each other so that they can divide and conquer them.
Yes. Yes. Another education-related question. As a professor, how have you seen the Great Replacement theory show up in class discussions and in overall campus language? And then how do you foster environments that can push back on those narratives?
So I think one way that it has showed up within campuses has been around the debate around affirmative action. Mm. And I write about in Chain of Ideas what I call the inversion of anti-racism.
Yes.
So this is the reframing of anti-racism, which is about equity and equality and creating equal opportunity for all. It's the reframing of anti-racism as anti-white. And that maps onto the framing of affirmative action as what? Anti-white. So I think that that's one area, and I have quite a bit of research, on that in Chain of Ideas.
Mm-hmm. So this question connects to kind of what we were starting to touch on at the end in terms of resistant movements. Do you feel that mass protests like the No Kings marches help in this fight against authoritarianism?
I do. And I think when you think about even the construct of the chain of ideas, mm-hmm. What, as I mentioned earlier, these authoritarians want is for people to submit to their own domination. So any demonstration that people are not submitting mm-hmm. is a good thing. Now, will that actually lead to, let's say, driving these people from power? Likely not. But it's still a demonstration that we have not submitted and we're not kissing the ring.
Okay. You heard it. You'll all be out there at the next No King rally in March. On Saturday. How is Project 2025 influenced by Great Replacement theory?
So great. So it shows up many times in the text. It shows up around what we talked about earlier in terms of blaming women, particularly white women, for white genocide. It shows up in terms of seeking to ban racial inequity, racial data collection, and reject the idea that racial inequity is a demonstration of racist policies. It shows up multiple times in the text.
Mm-hmm. And this question, this is definitely something that you, grapple with throughout the book. But this question is, what is it about this current time that is allowing this resurgence of authoritarianism and Great Replacement theory? What is it about this particular moment we're in?
So, this book could have just as easily been entitled Chain of Conditions, because in each section, I not only describe a particular link, but I also describe a set of, like an historical event that actually these theorists and politicians have been able to capitalize on. And so just to give you a quick run through of some of these historical events that I document in Chain of Ideas, and you're actually able to see how these politicians are leveraging these events to spread Great Replacement theory. It's everything from the Great Recession to Obama's election to the so-called European migrant crisis in 2015 to terror attacks around that time in Europe to the COVID-19 pandemic to all the way up to inflation. And so you see how they say things like, so people are struggling to pay for their groceries, and the government is instead spending all these money on immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when everyone in here reads your book, which they will, because they already got it with their ticket, or they're going to buy it right outside the door after our event, where they're for sale from the Commonwealth Club, and Dr. Kendi will be there signing them. When everybody reads this book, what do you hope readers take away, both in terms of their understanding of this moment, but also in terms of their own power?
Well, first, I hope that the book almost helps to serve as a set of prescription glasses so that they can now see Great Replacement theory and unfortunately see its pervasiveness. And that has, as I mentioned, been concealed. So I think people will be able to see that. People will also be able to see and hopefully begin to develop how they, through their own power, can resist it. And I think as it relates to our own power, I think what people have to give to that resistance is different. Yeah. But I think that I'm hoping that people recognize that this is an existential moment in the history of humanity in which we're either headed down a path towards racist dictatorships or we're going to build anti-racist democracies.
Mm-hmm. And I want to say that those are prescription glasses that you can't take off, because this is information. You can't unsee this. What you lay out in this book, these are not ideas that you can forget or unsee. So I'm excited for everybody to read this. And I have one really important, hard-hitting final question for you, Dr. Kendi. Is there like a particular song that you absolutely cannot resist? Like when it comes on the radio, even if you're in like a deeply serious moment, like you can't help but sing along, or it just like brings you joy?
Yes.
Will you tell us what it is?
There are many.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of one that brings me joy. Well, it's interesting because one that brings me joy, but I'll always connect to you, Kate, is one we talked about in the back, and that's Lil Jon's shots.
I was telling people how to pronounce my last name, which is Shots, and I say, well, my walk-on song could be the Lil Jon song when he goes, shots, shots, shots. And that reference only works for some people, as evidenced by the smattering of laughter here. But,
and it's interesting that would be a song that, because I really only drink wine or sangria, so it's like, I don't actually drink shot, but I just think people love that song. People get so excited. I'm like, man, it takes me back to college when I did have shots.
All right. On that note, now that you will always think of this moment and our authoritarian crisis when you hear Lil Jon on the radio. Dr. Kendi, thank you so much for writing this book and for spending your time and energy putting these books into the world that are going to last and be part of the chain of ideas that actually help us out of this moment and to a much better future.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Ubermex Kendi. Here we go. Again, please pick up a copy of the book outside. You'll be out there signing. And for information about Commonwealth Club membership and upcoming programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. Again, Bay Area welcome, and thank you for Dr. Kendi.